Okay, I too would like to thank you all for coming, and particularly to the Witzak family. You know, we're all here to talk about an awful thing, but for most of us, it's something that we've studied. It's something, certainly as a clinician, I've seen in patients. Fortunately, none of my patients died of it. But for the families that have experienced this in particular, I think it's extraordinary that they would come out and expend the kind of energy that they do trying to protect other people from this happening to them. So what I want to do today is give you a historical perspective for this, because a lot of people thought that the warnings that came out in 2004 kind of came out of the blue, and they didn't at all, and I really think it's very important for the media to understand that. I'm going to kind of fly through a lot of information, and we do have a question and answer period afterwards if you want to go over some specifics more. I personally am a moderate in this debate and want to say that up front. I prescribe antidepressants all the time, but I have been a critic of them being overprescribed and of patients not being warned adequately of side effects. And I think one of the most important functions that I serve in coming here today, quite apart from all the statistics and the 15-year history, is to say that I've personally witnessed this side effect in patients, and many, many of my colleagues have. And once you've seen it firsthand and you can distinguish it from the suicidality of depression, nobody can talk you out of it, including the FDA with fancy statistics. I want to focus, starting out, on Dr. Lofgren's overview for tomorrow's meeting, which I'm sure that all of you have been looking at, and you'll see that he very explicitly says that this is a phenomena that has been under discussion for decades. He actually quotes a 1960 textbook saying that antidepressants early in treatment appear to increase the risk of suicide. Up until fairly recently, up until the introduction of Prozac and the SSRIs, that was what was thought of as re-energizing depressed patients to act on suicidal urges that they already have. It was called the rollback phenomenon. It was that well established. And the big divide here was 1990, right after Prozac had been introduced, and two Harvard psychiatrists and many, many others, I have a long list here of other people who published on the same subject at the time, but Teicher and Cole really got a lot of attention because they were both at Harvard, they were both drug researchers, they'd actually done research for Lilly on Prozac, and they published a series of 6 patients in which they said that they had become obsessively preoccupied with suicide, and it appeared that the drug induced this. And that's key for you to understand, the idea that a drug could induce it as opposed to just energize somebody who already has suicidal thoughts. And as you heard about Woody's case, where his original diagnosis was insomnia, we have seen patients who were put on these drugs for headaches, for nail biting, for obsessive compulsive disorder, for depression without suicidality, who become acutely suicidal, especially in the early weeks of treatment or any time that the dose is changed. After Teicher and Cole's article, this exploded in the media in 1990. If you think there's been a lot of attention to this issue in 2004 and 2005, 2006, it's nothing like the attention that there was to it in 1990 and 91. And that's what I want you to really understand. The FDA held a hearing on September 20th, 1991, just like the hearings they held in 2004 and will hold tomorrow. There's a very long history to this. Going back to Dr. Lofgren's overview, you'll see that he says that the 1991 hearing found no clear evidence of an increased risk from antidepressants and that the committee did not recommend any warnings. Well, what Dr. Lofgren fails to tell you in his overview for tomorrow is that 5 of the 9 committee members in 1990 had such severe conflicts of interest, close ties to the pharmaceutical industry, that the FDA had to waive its own standards for conflicts of interest. That despite that, 3 of the 9 members, a third of the committee, voted for warnings back in 1991, that Teicher and Cole were not scheduled to speak to the committee, whereas 4 Eli Lilly doctors were, and that there were repeated comments, and I would encourage any of you journalists who are particularly interested in this subject to get the transcript of that 1991 hearing, and you'll see them over and over again, and this is just a series of quotes saying how crude the data was, how coarse the instruments were, and how much there was a need for more research. One of the things that the FDA repeatedly leaves out is what I would call the efficacy factor, which means that if you take a large population of patients and a significant number of them feel better and become less suicidal, okay, when you take the aggregate data, when you net that out, it's going to cover up a smaller number of patients becoming suicidal who never would have before. So it's a beneficial effect to a larger number of patients that masks a negative effect to a smaller number of patients, and we'll see how critical that is and still is today. Eli Lilly, back in 1991, and these are internal company documents that are now in the public record and would be readily available to you, agreed with the FDA to do a study, very different. All these studies we're looking at were studying depression and whether or not the drugs worked or other indications. The measures for suicidality were very crude and insensitive. You could do a study specifically looking at suicidality, treatment-emergent suicidality. That still hasn't been done, despite the fact that it was recognized in 1991 that there was a need for that. Lilly agreed to do it. Lilly developed more sensitive scales for assessing suicidality. They planned to share the scales with other companies that were testing SSRIs in the pipeline. They consulted over 200 experts to develop the protocol for the study. And after the hearing passed, they never did it. FDA didn't hold them to do it. FDA didn't get the companies who were studying other SSRIs to use the scales. Now, despite that, in about 1992, 93, 94, you see some individual researchers continuing to look into this side effect despite the kind of papering over it in 1991. And what you see them doing is zeroing in on a side effect called akathisia, which is the side effect that Woody and so many other patients have gotten. It's a form of severe agitation that there's a long literature of it making people suicidal going back to the 60s and 70s with an earlier class of drugs. And you see early papers as early as 1989 talking about akathisia with SSRIs. Here's a study done at Harvard of people who'd made suicide attempts at Prozac, given the Prozac again. They all developed akathisia. They all said it was that and not their underlying conditions that it caused it. Here's a study at UCLA. Here's a study at Columbia. All of this ignored by the FDA. There are two sides to akathisia. One is outer visible restlessness that you can observe, but the other, much more important one, is an extraordinary state of terror inside a person. Psychiatric drugs were used by the Soviet Union in the Gulag, large doses of them, to induce this side effect, and it was a form of torture. And if you talk to patients, it is torture. You can have mild, moderate, or severe restlessness, but this inner subjective agitation has been described as abject terror, anxiety, tension. That's what you heard Kim describing Woody with his hands to his head, saying he didn't know what was going on in him. Patients have described it to me and in the literature as being like listening to nails scratching on a blackboard 24/7, or your bones rattling like tuning forks. And it's this inner agitation that's by far the most severe, the most dangerous. It's been described, this is a quote from 1958, ladies and gentlemen, more difficult to endure than any of the symptoms for which patients were originally treated with the drugs. It's been described as behavioral toxicity of antidepressants, this is SSRIs, 1992, after the FDA hearing in 1991. And the way that suicidality emerges in this picture is one of two ways. For some patients, suicide becomes a way of escaping this side effect, literally, like death would be a welcome relief. And for other patients, it seems that as part of the syndrome, they actually develop an obsessive preoccupation with suicide. And I've talked to people who lived to describe this. The most vulnerable time period has been known in the literature for decades, early in treatment. FDA doesn't disagree with that now. And it's distinctly different from the suicidality of depression. When people get this side effect, they will tell you they want to kill themselves to escape this severe inner agitation. They feel like jumping out of their skin. They feel like jumping off a building. They feel like jumping off a roof or hanging themselves. When people are depressed, they're hopeless, helpless, worthless, and that's what they'll tell you they want to escape. It looks totally different, and the pharmaceutical companies and the FDA saying, well, how could you ever tell this apart from depression, is just completely misleading. We know how to treat akathisia. We understand the brain chemistry of why it's more likely to occur with SSRIs. Primary care doctors who write 70% of prescriptions for antidepressants know almost nothing about this side effect, and FDA is still not educating them. I'll show you that a little further along. And akathisia can in turn cause most of the other side effects on the FDA's list of the side effects that make people worse. For example, worsening insomnia. Akathisia makes people profoundly anxious. It can make them quite paranoid. In the mid-90s, again, my historical march, you get up to 1994, and the test case went to trial. It was in Louisville, Kentucky. It was a man who used an AK-47 automatic rifle to kill 8 people, wound 12 others, and then a handgun to kill himself. Lilly appeared to win a jury verdict in 1994. In actual fact, several years later, through the heroism of the judge in the case fighting Lilly, it turned out that Lilly had secretly settled the case, and the verdict was later changed to dismissed as settled. All of this is spelled out in Prozac Backlash and other publications on this. Testimony in the West Becker trial said that data was massaged by Lilly, that sedatives were heavily used to offset this anxiety and agitation, that when people became suicidal, Lilly coded it as depression. We now know that GlaxoSmithKline coded it as emotional lability, which is like being very emotional, kind of crying one minute and laughing the next. You have people like Dr. Peter Brigham in 1994 publishing Talking Back to Prozac and revealing a lot of this. My book came out in 2000. Dr. Healy, as was said earlier, has published numerous books and articles. The one I'm highlighting here is his landmark study in 2000 of healthy volunteers on Zoloft, where I believe it's 10% of them became suicidal. These were healthy volunteers, dismissing the pharmaceutical argument that, well, it's just depression. This is clearly described in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, since 2000. Here's other textbooks, including American Psychiatric Association textbook of psychopharmacology, clearly describing SSRIs causing akathisia and akathisia making people suicidal. More textbooks that I'm just going to flip through, but to give you a feel for it, this has not come out of the blue. This has been well known for years and years, and FDA has not taken adequate protection. There have been lawsuits, many, many lawsuits, secretly settled. It's a shame that we are discussing this issue with so many of the documents still confidential. We are only able to talk to you about the documents that have become public in the few cases where the lawyers were able to make that happen, either because they went to trial or because they used legal means to try and force some of the documents out. But it's a crime that we are discussing this without all the documents being public, given the public health and safety issues involved. In those suits, experts for the pharmaceutical industry have acknowledged that akathisia is a risk factor for suicide. Look at the data on that, 2000, well before the FDA's next hearing in 2004. Here's another expert for Pfizer. In 2001, we had the landmark Tobin case in Wyoming. This was a murder-suicide, a man who went on Paxil and within days murdered his wife, his daughter, his granddaughter, and then committed suicide. The only one in the family who survived was his son-in-law. He brought a lawsuit, and it was an $8 million jury verdict. It was the first jury verdict. It got a lot of documents into the public record, as had the West Becker trial. Come up to 2002, 2003, the developments in the UK, and I really want to impress upon you, as journalists, that the impetus for everything that has happened since 2003 has not come from FDA, and it has not come from the British regulators. It came from the media. And it was the BBC ran 2 very hard-hitting exposés in 2002 and 2003 on Paxil causing severe withdrawal and suicide. And it's very unfortunate. I know journalists in this country who tried to run those kind of shows and they couldn't, and I'm convinced that it was because of the influence of advertising on television in this country. The BBC doesn't have to deal with that. That put a lot of pressure on the British regulators, who formed a committee to look at this, much like the FDA does. The first committee was riddled with conflict of interest, public humiliation for the British regulators, and had to be disbanded. This is the second of the 2 exposés. New committees started looking at this just when the data on children taking these antidepressants was brought into the regulators. The companies, if they can show that the drugs work in children, get a 6-month extension on the patent, for everyone, which is worth an absolute fortune. So that's why the pediatric data was coming in 2002, 2003. So there's a spotlight in England on the companies and this side effect. The pediatric data came in, and the committee, the new committee, much cleaner committee, was asked to look at it and said, oh my gosh, there's a threefold statistically significant increase in suicidality in children taking this drug. The British, by the late 2003, had instituted a virtual ban on SSRIs for children because the British factor in efficacy. There isn't proven benefit of antidepressants for children. Everyone knows that. The one exception is a study of Prozac. There are all kinds of problems with that study. If you take the aggregate for kids with antidepressants, and I can tell you why later in the question and answer if you're particularly interested in that, but there isn't proven efficacy, and the British weighed. Why would you give kids drugs that could cause this kind of deadly suicide side effect if you haven't proven any efficacy? FDA doesn't do that. They don't weigh the two. And I'll show you Dr. Laughran's quote from his overview for tomorrow. So this put pressure on FDA, and they finally held a hearing in 2004. They suppressed their own experts' report that found the same thing that the British did, wasted taxpayer money and months and months and months and more deaths to get all the data reclassified by Columbia, who came up with the same conclusion. Many of you probably know that Elliot Spitzer sued GlaxoSmithKline in this time period for fraud for the way in which they handled the pediatric data. GlaxoSmithKline did settle that suit. The FDA finally held a hearing in 2004. I think in particular it was the pediatricians on that advisory board who were very moved by the data and by the testimony, and we finally got the first warning. A black box became official in 2005 that antidepressants, especially at the beginning of therapy or whenever the dose changes, up or down, so you heard Vera talk about withdrawal, very, very important. Please notice in Dr. Laughran's overview that he says that with regard to children, the black box warning advises prescribers that they have to balance the risk with, quote, clinical need. He's being very disingenuous there to say clinical need because he can't say benefit because there isn't proven benefit. And this is what the FDA keeps doing, is ignoring the efficacy side of the data. Here's the FDA list of side effects, akathisia among them, but I want to highlight also mania and hypomania. FDA has emphasized hypomania and mania. They devote an entire paragraph in the detailed warning, look at it, to mania and hypomania. This is just another way of blaming the patients. For years, they told us it was depression. Now they can't do that. So now they're saying it's triggering mania and hypomania. That's not true. If you look at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, you're not supposed to diagnose people as manic if they only look like that for the first time in antidepressants. It's a substance-induced mood disorder. If you look at the British list, mania and hypomania don't even appear. If you look at the Canadian list, it really emphasizes agitation, akathisia, and it also explicitly acknowledges aggression and violence, which FDA has so far failed to do. By 2006, this past spring, GlaxoSmithKline acknowledged for the first time that in their studies of adults with major depressive disorder, there was a 6.7-fold statistically significant increase in the risk of suicidal behavior. This was huge. This was another landmark, did not get adequate attention because of the way in which it was carefully presented to the media. Here's the analysis that we're all looking at and that Vera talked to you about in a little more detail. FDA is emphasizing the statistical significance of the under 25, but look at 45 to 54, 45 to 64, two-fold-ish increase, not quite statistically significant, and they want to just ignore that. Inappropriate statistically, as Vera has said. It's been much written about the very, very high bar that FDA is holding us to in order to acknowledge safety. It's been true of all of the other drugs that there have been scandals about in recent years as well. It's very important to keep in mind that this is still poor data. This is still data based on studies for depression, OCD, anxiety disorders. None of it's data from studies prospectively designed to look at treatment-emergent suicidality. Again, FDA repeatedly leaves efficacy out of the equation. One of the possibilities here, I personally don't think that this is all the data you saw. Vera showed you that, but one of the possibilities here is that because the drugs don't work in children, it essentially unmasks the induction of suicide by the drugs. So if once you get into middle-aged adults, you have some beneficial effect that makes some people less suicidal, in aggregate population data, it's going to cover that up. But if you acknowledge that it doesn't work in kids, it's going to reveal the induction of suicide. Again, FDA hasn't done anything about that, leaving efficacy out of the question and still not asking the companies to do the studies that are needed to really look at this. Here's the Paxil data in particular. Clearly a statistically significant, almost threefold increase in suicidality. They themselves acknowledge that that's 6.7 if you just look at adults with major depressive disorder. FDA's handling of this side effect has been shameful. I talk in Prozac Backlash about a 10, 20, 30-year pattern, which we've seen over and over again with psychiatric drugs, where very early on, there are reports of some of what will prove to be the most serious side effects. In the first decade, the companies will so aggressively defend the drugs that we just don't get anywhere. And by the middle of the second decade, you start to see warnings, which is exactly what's happening. And guess what? Most of the drugs have gone off patent. The companies are no longer fiercely defending them. In fact, there's evidence that the companies actually cooperate and start to help discredit the earlier class of drugs that are now going off patent and are no longer profitable. Why? Because they have a new class in the pipeline that they're going to bring out as allegedly safer, largely because we don't know the risks. I can assure you that the next class of antidepressants that comes out will be marketed as causing less suicidality, which probably won't be true. How many decades are we going to have to wait for the FDA and the pharmaceutical industry to adequately research this and adequately warn about this side effect? The industry for years has been denying our case reports as anecdotes. Guess what? The anecdotes in 1991 were right. The junk science was wrong. The industry response has been to blame patients' psychiatric conditions. First, depression. They can't do that anymore, so now it's mania, hypomania. They scare the media away from dealing with the truth about this by saying that if you tell patients, if you warn patients, you'll scare them away from treatment. And again, I'm here to say that's not true. That's a dreadful authoritarian approach to medicine that's completely outdated. The most dangerous scenario is when doctors and patients don't know about this. Patients get the side effect, think they're a hopeless case, and are at very serious risk. I've warned people since the mid-1990s. Nobody who legitimately needed treatment has been scared away from it. All of them have been grateful to be told about a potentially fatal side effect. And I would ask you, if you were going to go on an antidepressant, or you were going to put one of your children on an antidepressant, or your spouse was going to go on an antidepressant, or one of your parents was going to go on an antidepressant, would you have been wanted to be warned about this for the last 15 years? Or would you have preferred an authoritarian approach like the Witsacks were subjected to, where you were told nothing, and this dreadful thing could strike you like a lightning bolt in your family? Thank you very much.